and welcome to Waves of YA, a podcast focused on YA literacy, brought to you by the Ocean County Library's Teen Literacy Workgroup. My name is Cecilia. I'm one of the Teen Services Librarians at the Ocean County Library. Joining me today, we have...
It's Lindsay. I'm also a teen librarian at the Ocean County Library.
And I am Narrator Sophie Amoss.
Yes, we have a special guest today. So for today's episode, we will be focused on the crossover appeal. We'll be discussing narrating for different audiences and how titles written for one age group can be enjoyed by others. But before we get started on the topic today, we have some interview questions for Sophie. So how did you get started narrating books? Are you an actor first? What comes first?
Yes, I'm an actor. It seems audiobook narration is a sort of a natural branch of acting. So you'll find that most audiobook narrators come from acting. Not all of them, but most. So I studied acting most of my life. I grew up in New Orleans and I attended an art high school alongside with my normal public high school. And then I went on into college and went to study theater. Pursued being a struggling actor in Chicago and went on to graduate school. And while I was in graduate school in New York studying acting, an alum came by and was speaking to us, and she brought up voice acting. And they didn't even teach this in our graduate program. And they still don't really teach a lot of voice acting, which is curious. They might do like a workshop, but it's not really something that is taught as part of the curriculum. So I sought classes outside and I got into commercial voice acting and found success in that. And so when I finished graduate school, I found success in commercial voice acting. While that was fun, you can book a big gig, but you're not booking them every day. And I wanted to work every day. I didn't want to audition every day. Even successful actors, they mostly audition. That's kind of mostly what they're doing. And I had heard that the audiobook people were in town, and on a whim, went to their annual conference, and just a whole new world opened up to me. And it's one of those careers that it's not just something you decide to do like a 9 to 5. It's very self-propelling, it's very, you got to put money into it and time into it. A lot of people turn their closets into a sound booth, and they buy a microphone, and they start working, sort of in the sort of self-publishing sector and sort of work their way up. So it's a very, you got to really want to do it. That's for sure. So yes, but it comes from this, I would say most of us are actors for sure.
Now, where do you record? Do you have a closet studio?
I don't. I never had a closet studio. I was lucky. So I was in New York, and I did invest in, it's sort of a funny story. When I was a kid, the school encouraged our parents to hey, buy your kid like $50 worth of stocks so they can learn about the stock market or something. My mom bought me like $50 in Pixar. And this was right when Toy Story had just come out. I was about 10 or so when Toy Story came out.
Okay.
And later on, Disney acquired Pixar. And so I was trying to find money to buy a sound booth. Fast forward, I'm like 29 years old. And my mom's like, well, why don't you sell the stocks? I'm like, how much would this be worth? Turns out it was like worth $5,000.
Wow.
And I had no idea. So I sold my Disney stock that I had gotten in fourth grade. It was like $50 and that I had done nothing with. And I bought like a booth, and I kind of used that to start off and do auditions and do some of my earlier sort of self-publishing stuff. But eventually, once I got the attention of publishing houses, and because I was physically in New York City, I would go into Penguin Random House. That's how I spent the first 7 years of my career, going into Macmillan and Penguin and all these places, just hopping on the subway and actually going to the source. So that was kind of the added benefit of being in New York. I recently relocated back to New Orleans.
Okay.
So it's been a challenge because I sold that booth and I bought a glorious big new booth, but it arrives shortly from Spain in about 2 weeks. It's very nerve-wracking. And it's this very big industrial thing. And so I will operate out of that. And it's basically the exact same thing that one of these studios has. But in the meantime, I've been working out of studios here in New Orleans. And it's pretty easy. There's an engineer here, just like there is in New York. Sometimes they'll zoom in like this, and they can even control my computer remotely and engineer me from New York. So it is almost no different. It's pretty cool.
pretty awesome.
Amazing. They figured all this during the pandemic.
Yeah, they had to.
Yeah, they kind of had to, a lot of doors opened because of the pandemic where you had to physically be in New York. Most narrators are all over the country, but things like being directed over Zoom with a director or with an engineer, that usually was done in person. So it's really cool that Zoom and all these other things, we now have the capability of doing anything.
Yeah, and I imagine with everyone reading more, there's more demand for books and audio and everything.
Audio is a format that keeps growing. We keep seeing it grow by the double digits in the percentage. Print not doing so great, but audio is going up and up and up for sure.
Yeah, I can see that. People want to stay on the go. They don't.
Yeah.
So audio is pretty cool. That's awesome. I love that you can just kind of be wherever now and you can work. That's a benefit, I guess. Yeah. Cool. All right. So should we get into the book stuff? So when you're recording a book, which point of view do you enjoy narrating the most?
It's a really interesting question, and it comes up a lot in conversations among narrators. We have our yearly conference and people bring this up. I don't find it too different. And I'll tell you why, because it depends on the style of writing. Not all third person is created equal. The style of writing dictates, right? Third person can be incredibly intimate. It can almost feel like first person. And then first person can sometimes almost feel detached and removed, depending on the state of that person's mind. So it's not so much I'm focusing on the POV. I'm focusing on the style of writing that the author is giving me. How are they setting the tone? So there's a wonderful director within audiobooks, Paul Rubin, and he talks about it almost like the eye of God. Sometimes it's like down here, right by your ear. And sometimes it's way up high like a bird. And it can shift even in one sentence. It doesn't always remain steady, even in the book. I think that is true for both first person POV and third person. So when I look at a book, I don't approach a book any different if it's first person or third person. I basically look at what is the story here and how and in what way is the author trying to tell the story? How are they using the way that they write, the style in which they write, rhythm, texture, tone, environment, the type of characters to tell that story? And how do I lift that up and make that apparent, make that the star, and help bring the listener to meet that tone? So I guess the short answer is I don't think there's too much of a difference.
That's great. I love that. I found that because I'm like fairly new to listening to audiobooks, maybe just the past few years. And at first I could only do first person. I could not get through a book unless it was first person. But now I'm getting better. I feel like I've been training myself pretty well. So I can enjoy all the books.
It's fun. And also it's just and span out with different types of narrators, just like there's different types of POV, there's different types of style of narrating. Narrators approach, the way I approach a book is not how every other narrator approaches a book,
Right.
And some listeners are going to like the way I tell a story and some are not going to like it. Everyone has their thing. So sometimes you just like, okay, this I like. And then another narrator, you're like, it's not really my style, but definitely give everything a chance because you never know, what flips the boat until you try
for sure. Cool.
So you kind of talked about how you do your process. How do you prepare for a book before you start narrating?
You definitely, obviously, you're reading the book. You have to obviously know the story and all the characters and all the arcs.
Right.
I almost feel like it's best to know nothing about the book if you can. Generally, you know something because a producer or the publisher has come to you. Either you've recorded a little bit of a sample or they've just flat out offered you the book. So you know something about it. I think before sitting down and reading it and thinking about the characters, like reading it as a whole internally, it's good to sit down and actually read it out loud to yourself. Not the whole thing, but maybe a chapter or two. Because especially good writing, a good book, good writing, sort of, if we're going to get lofty here, just like Shakespeare. So Shakespeare, the way he writes and how he places his lines and where his lines end and all of his punctuation, that's informative. Those are breaths. He did that intentionally. It's part of what adds meaning and how he tells the story. And the punctuation is the breath. That is the new thought coming in. Modern writers are very skilled as well. So how they write is intentional. Skilled writers and modern writers are intentional in the way they write. And so it's our job as narrators to pick up on that. We can't just copy and paste and do the same thing for every book. Then every book's going to sound the same. And we're just ignoring everything, right? So saying it out loud so that we get, okay, this book is telling me the rhythm it wants. It's telling me the pace it wants. It's telling me where it wants the pauses, where it wants me to speed up, where it wants a little bit of texture, where it wants environment, where it wants me to back off a little bit. It's informing me what to do. It's important to pay attention to those things because that's also going to inform me for character decisions. Because there are a lot of books that'll be like, he had a gravelly voice. There's a million ways you can do a gravelly voice. But you want to take all this other information. What kind of a gravelly voice? You know, if you're doing something that's like middle grade and it's a girl who's going on some adventure and she meets a pirate and she meets someone with a gravelly voice, well, the pirate's going to be maybe a little bit more, you know, animated. Now, if I did a gravelly voice in a literature, like lit fit, you know, for like an adult like that, it would probably pull the listener out because that's just like a little over the top, right? Whereas a gravelly voice might be just a little bit more down here because he's a truck driver and he might kill you, but he might help you out. You know, that's more of like the gravelly voice for an adult. You know what I mean? So paying attention to the style of the book, things like that. Does a character start off as a good character and then later we find out they're the bad character? How do we present that to the listener? How is the author presenting that? Is the author intentionally trying to mislead its listeners and readers, and are we supposed to mislead them as well? Things like that are important. Any kind of foreign language, any hard to pronounce words, we have to look this all up. We have to be accurate. We can't just guess. Sometimes if we're really overwhelmed and we have a lot of work, we actually hire people called preppers. And their job is essentially this. They more or less just read the book and they write up a report. And it's usually a chapter breakdown. They'll give us the characters, any physical descriptions, any tricky words, things for us so that we can take that sort of prep time and just go, it happens. But I would describe that as sort of the basic prep. But overall, after we've analyzed plot and characters, the main thing is figuring out the heartbeat of the book and the style of the author. I find that when you can tap into that, listeners really respond. When you really get a genre, when you really get an author, people love it. And that's when that's most of what we have to do.
A lot more than I think I realized.
Yeah. But it makes so much sense that you put all that thought and like the different age genres and stuff, that you would put all that thought into it. And like the gravel voice, like that just explained it so perfectly. I was like, yeah, you would not do that if you were doing an adult book.
You gotta feel and listen to the book and what's appropriate to the book. You gotta feel what's appropriate for the listeners and what the author's goal is. You have to, and that requires good instincts. At that point, it's not even almost about how well you are doing voices or being an actor. That's your editing skills. That's your producer skills. That's you understanding what you're doing and are your choices going to fit? Are these the correct choices? So you have to put on kind of a lot of different hats as a narrator.
Yeah, I feel like I had that experience listening to a YA book recently. It was dual narrated. It was a male and female, and the male narrator was, they were supposed to be teens, but he was an adult male, and there was no getting around it. And I was like, I can't listen to this because it made me feel weird because he just sounded like a very mature male, and she did not. And it didn't work for me, so I had to quit it. But
sometimes it happens, and sometimes it's not even his fault. Like sometimes they just cast it wrong and stuff like that. I have to be very careful because I'm definitely an adult woman, but I sound much younger and look much younger. So I definitely get cast much younger. And then sometimes I get cast more closer to my age, and I'm like, I mean, I am this age, but I don't sound, I don't know. I have to really weigh it, but yeah.
I love that. So how long would you say, can you tell us the longest time it took for you to record and the shortest? Like
I think I just did the longest. Well, so every book's going to be different, right?
Right.
There's no average book. The longest book, I think I just did the longest book. It was very, very dense. It probably took us 11 to 12 days. And I think it's going to be about 25 hours long.
Wow.
That's a long one. Book.
Very long book. It was a lot. The shortest, probably we also do lots of multicast.
Mm-hmm.
I've gone in for like a line. I've gone in for 2 lines, I've gone in where I've only recorded for 30 minutes, things like that. So, I would say on average standalone books, anything from 3 to 5 days, that kind of thing, because everything seems to be between like 250 to 450 pages, it could be somewhere in there, but it's, everyone records at a different pace, so I get about 2 recorded hours done a day, which is pretty slow. Some people might get 3 in, but I like to chat with my engineer. I'm a bit naughty. I like to think, how's your day going? So everyone works at a different speed, and then also it depends on the style of the book. Is this more, film noir and it's very slow, or is it very chatty and has a lot of dialogue? It depends like that. So something could be like the book that was like 25 hours. I've done a book that's like 420 pages and it's like 10 hours or even 8 hours. That one's 420 pages, but it's also formatted and it's also like super dense.
Right.
So, and it's super chatty. So that's just how it's also about word count too, as well. Okay. So that's the longest one I just finished.
That's awesome. The longest book I listened to was like 48 hours or something. It took me, and that really was before I was pumping up the speed. So took me like 2 months to listen to.
I had no idea it was that long.
It's very, very long.
I think the longest I tried to listen to, I never finished it, was Game of Thrones, which was like 31-ish hours.
Yeah.
So
that's really, and now that I think about it, I think the longest one I ever listened to, it's still one of my favorites, is Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. So good. So Scott Brick narrated that one. Oh, I would highly recommend it, but doesn't even cut it close to what you guys listen to. It's 19 hours, but that's not even like I said, like I think before this 25-hour book, I think the longest one before that was actually my favorite audiobook I've ever done. It was 15 hours. And that was the longest one I had ever done. I would say again, like everything kind of within that 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kind of 12. That's kind of the range for most average kind of books. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Are there any types of books you haven't done yet but would like to in the future?
Yes, I would love to do a memoir. I will say I've been lucky in the sense that no one's put me in a corner or pin me to one genre. I've had a pretty eclectic, it's been all over the place, which I've been very lucky and fortunate with. So I've got a lot of, YA and literary fiction and thrillers and even a few rom-coms. And I did my first nonfiction, which was very interesting. And I really enjoyed. And it was very sort of science oriented. It was called The Joy of Sweat. And it's really fascinating. And you'll learn more than you ever wanted to know about how we sweat. But I would love to do historical nonfiction. And especially things like, I love history about like World War II, things like that. I'd be interested in that. Anything about my hometown, maybe about New Orleans. But memoirs are also super interesting. There was a memoir I auditioned for years ago that was really interesting because it was a memoir about a poet. I didn't end up getting the book, but it was just interesting because this particular poet suffered a little bit from mental illness. And so the way it was written was sort of flitting between the now and the then, and in a very poetical way. And so it was a very unusual format. And I thought that was really interesting. So I would say those two genres are something I'd love to explore.
Do you have a favorite genre that you've done?
I mean, it's such a broad thing to say, but literary fiction, but I mean, because that's just like, that's like a lot of things, right? But it's just because it's usually just very good writing, right? So generally when anything that's sort of literary fiction, you're going to get something from the big 5 publishers, and it's going to be really, really good writing. And because it's really good writing, it's going to be a really good story. And the writing is so good because the author's going to have a very distinct style. And the producers at that level, and now that I've been working with them for years, when they cast you, it's almost surgically amazing because you get it and you go, oh, I am so perfect for this. I see why you cast me. And it makes your life and your work so much easier because we work with all kinds of books, very highbrow. And sometimes you get, not the best books and all this kind of stuff. When it's kind of not so great, it's kind of clunky. You find that you're messing up more and you're having to stop and, move the cursor and fix things more. When the writing is really good, you're not messing up as much. And it's just like butter. You're just moving along. You're just clicking in with the author and the story. And it just makes it that much more of a delight. So that's also kind of why literary fiction. And it's just usually also just more likely books that I myself would like to pick up. That kind of reasoning as well. And I don't really pick up books anymore because I read for a living and I don't have time.
Do you keep track of the books that you read for work, like on Goodreads or like a book tracker?
I mean, I think I have like a document.
Okay.
So I don't forget, because sometimes you don't, like on Audible, like you come up for like 90% of your stuff, but sometimes you're on something like, and it just says full cast. So you just like, oh yeah, I'm in that. It tends to not be healthy. We tend to pay attention to things like Audiophile magazine. That's a really good source for reviews of audiobooks. Audible, it's hit or miss. It's like the Yelp of audiobooks. You can get, people 5 stars and 1 stars and very mixed messages, and people forget that we're human beings on the other end. And they're like, I hate her voice. And you're like, I'm a person. Most experienced narrators don't look at it. It's good to look at it sometimes. Sometimes it's important to look at that stuff because I remember not too long ago, we discovered that a file got uploaded incorrectly or something like that. And so a reviewer alerted us to that. And so we were able to correct it through the publisher and fix it so that the file was fixed through Audible and that reviewer got their full book. So that's important in that regard. But it tends to be a healthy way to check in on reviews in an unhealthy way. And so I would say we avoid those channels in particular.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I have a question because you mentioned fixing any errors. If you have to go back and change something, is it really annoying where you have to like record a lot of it, or can you record a word or two and they kind of fix it? Because I feel like sometimes when I'm listening, I can hear a word or two words that all of a sudden get louder, and then it keeps going back.
Yeah, that probably was that. So we're fixing mistakes constantly.
Mhm.
So there's generally, for the most part, there's two ways in which audiobooks are being recorded. And the vast majority are being recorded in a method called punch and roll, meaning like 95% of narrators are recording themselves and they're engineering themselves. So they're in their booth and they have a monitor and keyboard and their computer is outside. You don't hear the fan of the computer. And they're going to mess up probably several times in a page. So when they mess up, there's usually like a shorthand. There's like a space to stop or whatever. And then they're usually putting the cursor and they can see the waypoint. So they can see the space in between where the breath is and they can place it there. And when they hit record, there's where we have a bit of pre-roll, like 2 seconds. So they hear themselves and then they know exactly when to come in. This all happens like that. They just, and then they hear themselves and they go right in their headset. And so this is a very quick thing. It's called punch and roll. When you're working with an engineer, they're doing this. And then no words need to be exchanged because you just stop speaking. You messed up. They know you messed up and they punch you back in. Sometimes a word might trip you up that you didn't look up previously and you go, oh, what's this? And you might have to go to Merriam-Webster and you have to go to a reliable source and look something up, that kind of thing. So those are the things that we're doing in the moment. Later, after in post, it's going through something called QC. So there's lots of things. There's human ears, I should say, and eyes that are going through the script and following it. More recently, they're having software that's also processing it. And the software basically is also looking for mistakes. The software prints out a report, but a human also goes through it. And it looks for things that are like slurred or maybe gets cut off, but they have to make decisions. Sometimes it goes, well, it's not so much that it got cut off. This is just a conversational style for this narrator. So we're going to let this one go. Things like that. Or this is mispronounced. And that's called a pickup package. And they'll send that maybe a few weeks later to the narrator. And it's usually the pages that those mistakes are on, they'll highlight. They usually want to get the whole sentence. Maybe they only need a half of the sentence from like one breath to the other breath. And you usually want to be in the same space, same microphone. So you're usually in your home studio where you recorded it. Or if you were at a studio, you go to that same studio. And they have the audio clip and they have a note. So you can hear yourself, hear what you did, and then you do it again so that it can match as best as possible. And then an editor goes in and puts them in. And usually they're pretty clean. They can go in. And I guess probably for that one, it wasn't. It jumped out a little bit more to you. But they're generally pretty good about blending them in. So there's tons of mistakes. And sometimes miscommunications happen about like, oh, well, we want a name to be pronounced this way. And someone else decides that's not how the name's pronounced, and you find that you're going to have to say that name 50 times in the pickup package, and that's a nightmare. But we've, as a community, have gotten better and better at this process. So those mistakes are rare, I would say. So there's the mistakes that happen during, and then the mistakes that we fix after. You probably were hearing the after pickups and that it just wasn't as smooth.
Yeah.
As smoothly inserted as it could have been.
For sure. It's happened a couple of times, not too many, but I do notice it. I don't know.
Yeah.
What aspects, and I know you talked about this a little bit, of the different age groups that you've narrated for, what do you enjoy most about the different portions of it?
I definitely think that as far as things like middle grade, there's a lot there. You can be a little bit more whimsical. You can have a little bit more fun and a little bit more cheeky and sort of whimsical with your voice and make a little bit, more bold choices. Kids are a little bit more accepting.
Mm-hmm.
If you decide that, like, a wizard is like, ooh, 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 you're like, okay, yeah, that's what a wizard sounds like. They're not going to fight you on it. And they're also not likely going to write like an audible, like, this is horrible. They're not. be thoroughly entertained. You know what I mean? Like, you're telling them a story. They're very excited. So I would say that's very enjoyable about middle grade. YA is so interesting because I think YA has gone through this like really interesting transformation over the last 10 years. It's so much more daring than it ever was, at least for me when I was growing up. I think we can, since especially because of what this episode is about, we can agree that YA is a broad reaching audience, right? Because there are people in their 20s who are enjoying YA, even in their 30s. And there are people who are teenagers who are enjoying YA. And so you can have YA that I would describe as, quote, a little bit maybe more PG, but still, like, again, enjoyable for those age ranges. And then things that like deal with maybe much more like bigger themes, again, like sexuality, orientation, how you identify, that are, yeah, very daring, that I don't think I saw 15 years ago at all. And also just, there's just so much. There's so many topics. It's just like, you can take all of those topics and then be like, yeah, but do you want it with witches? Or do you want it with like werewolves? Do you want it set at a mortuary? Or do you want it set in Britain? You know what I mean? Like, it's like, there's so many options, but it's great and it's fun and it doesn't treat its audience like children. And I think that's why it's wildly popular. And obviously, given like how I sound, and oh my God, if they saw how I look, they'd be like, of course, this is why you do this. Like, not only does she sound young, she looks young. But so I obviously do a lot. And also like right now, like I don't have a headset. I'm talking in my teeth resonators. This is how if I'm talking normally, it's a little bit more like this. But when I'm relaxed, I'm a little bit more down here. I'm like the perfectly dejected teenager, just like whatever.
Yeah. I have listened to you be a teenager, so yeah, I can agree.
So funny that you were talking about appealing to different age groups. That just unlocked a memory that like an elderly patron was coming in looking for YA titles for her mom, and she was just like, she just likes historical YA fiction. She just really enjoys it.
Happens a lot.
It is one of those genres that has just unlocked something that is just appealing for a lot of age ranges.
Yeah, and I think older people like harken back to, it's that nostalgia feeling too of being a teen and kind of like still having everything ahead of you or whatever. And like those emotions and stuff.
Yeah,
that's definitely.
And I think like Sophie was saying, how it wasn't like this a decade ago, just the topic and content. People that are older are still just coming up to face those things in their life. So to like YA is where it is, because that's where a lot of kids are first coming to terms with their sexuality or their identity. So some adults, it's late for them. It happens later. So I think that helps them, attracts them to YA.
I think that, bear with me, because it's going to sound like it starts sad, but I promise you it's not sad. So my grandmother passed away. See, sounds sad. My grandmother passed away in October 2019. She was a children's book author and illustrator. And my dad did the eulogy, and he started off, and it was about her career. And one of the things she didn't understand was how people dismissed children's books and as something not to be taken seriously. And she was like, it is a serious thing. Like, children's literature has an impact on kids. And I think that for a very long time, people didn't take YA seriously. Boy, that was a mistake, wasn't it? Now you go to Barnes and Noble, it's like half the store.
Yep. It really is.
Yeah, right?
Do you have recommendations for books that have great crossover appeal for multiple age groups?
We can all answer that.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys go first. Oh my God, that's so much pressure. Because I'm just going to give books that I've done. That's
okay.
That sounds so bad. You guys go first.
I feel like I always, at work especially, I'm always handing out Jason Reynolds to
Oh yeah.
all ages because he has middle grade YA, but even adults, I always recommend him because I think he just has a really, I don't know, I just love him. And I think he's a really good writer and narrator. I like listening to him too.
I always hand out Karen McManus to adults looking for stuff, mysteries. They've read the entire mystery section in the library. Well, have you tried YA?
Okay, there's two that I did recently that I think have some good crossover. There's this book called The Second Death of Edie and Violet Bond by Amanda Glaze. It takes place in 1880s San Francisco. It's about two twin sisters who are mediums. It's a YA, but I think it's got good crossover. Another YA that I think has good crossover is called The Agathas by Kathleen Glasgow and Liz Lawson. That one's pretty funny. And again, The Agathas is kind of because Agatha Christie, and they kind of go on their own little, it's a high school sort of detective thing, I would say. I'm trying to think of if there might be any other. I'm scrolling really quickly.
Yeah, I was just scrolling.
Scroll.
So you read The Second Death of
I did read that one, The Second Death of Edie and Violet Bond.
I have an arc of it, but now I'll wait to listen to it.
You know what? This one I actually think is good. I'm going to stand. It's not YA. It's a little dark, but I actually think that this one could be interesting as a sort of reverse, as far as like instead of like an adult meeting the teenager halfway in the YA, this would be the teenager meeting the adult halfway where they are.
Which happens a lot. Yeah. A lot of kids.
Yeah. So this is called A Crooked Tree by Una Manon, Mannion. It's by HarperCollins, and it takes place in the 70s. It's about a family, and they're in a car, and like one of the daughters kind of acts up, and the mother's like, get out of the car. And they don't think about it. And then the daughter goes missing for a few hours, and all hell breaks loose. It's very 70s nostalgic. So I think a lot of Gen Xers and adults will really appreciate it. And it's also kind of got that sort of, the protagonist is 16, and it's constantly, they don't ever think to go to the adults because the adults aren't paying attention. It's that kind of that 70s, no one's paying attention, no one's listening to us. So we're going to just have to figure this out. There's someone here who is, a predator that we need to stop and figure out who it is. So it's dark in a way, but I do think there's some crossover there because, again, it does have that, because it's told through the eyes of a 16-year-old, and it does have that sort of, no one's listening to us. Why aren't the adults listening to us? And again, I think it has that nostalgia of the 70s. So that has some interesting crossover, I think, in there. A Crooked Tree, but anyway.
I can attest to that.
Read that one.
I listened to you read it. It was wonderful.
Oh, you listened to it?
I listened to it, a while ago. Maybe a few months ago. What does it say?
What's time?
It tells you
in March. On Goodreads, it tells me when I finished. So in March, I read it in March.
I love that one. I don't know. I liked that one a lot.
It was great.
It's a good written book. Yeah, it's well written.
Thanks for joining us today. Be sure to check out the Ocean County Library's website for more podcasts and events. All titles mentioned in today's episode can be found through the Ocean County Library, free with your library card. Until next time, happy reading.